In 1946, the US Navy filmed itself making a promise.
Turn this great destructive force into something good for mankind.
3, 2, 1, fire!
A Commodore in dress whites stood on a beach in the Central Pacific and gave a short speech to 167 islanders that would change all of their lives indefinitely. He proposed a temporary relocation. Temporary, it turns out, was the most flexible word in that speech. He said it was for the good of mankind, and he made them a promise that they could return to their island when the work was done. Their leader, a man called King Judah, agreed on camera. That was 80 years ago. None of them have ever been allowed home. Today's strange place is called Bikini Atoll. Most people have heard the name. They've heard it because the bikini swimsuit was named after the island in 1946 by a French designer who thought a bomb test in the Pacific that summer was the most attention-grabbing thing in the world. He was right about the attention. The bombs are the part of this story most people know. The promise is the part nobody talks about. The grandchildren of those same islanders are alive now in 2026. They live on a smaller, sinking island called Kili, 700 kilometres south of the home they were promised they could return to. What I want to know is this: if the Navy filmed itself promising these people they could come home, why is the promise still unkept in 2026? And what's actually going on in Bikini today? Before any of that, we get to the 1st of March 1954, the Castle Bravo nuclear bomb test, the one that was expected to produce 6 megatons of explosive force, and produced 15. Right, before we get to any of it, the test, the migration, the bodies, the lawsuits, it's worth saying where this story actually is right now. In 2026, Bikini Atoll has no permanent residents. The US still administers the Marshall Islands under a compact of free association, and Bikini specifically sits under a kind of soft jurisdiction. Technically Marshallese sovereign territory, practically still a US Department of Energy site. The atoll is open to limited research access. Scientists can fly in. The lagoon is one of the most famous dive sites on Earth, full of warships the US sunk in 1946 to study what nuclear weapons did to navies. Tourists can charter their way in for a week of diving when the boats are running, but nobody lives there. The roughly 600 Bikinians on Kili are still officially designated displaced persons 80 years on. Some of their cousins live on Edgit, a small parcel granted to the community on Majuro Atoll. Many more live across the US mainland, scattered through the wider Marshallese diaspora that's now larger off-island than on it. The reason they can't go back is in the soil. The cesium-137 measurements in coconut and breadfruit grown on Bikini, in the most recent published surveys, are still above the threshold the Marshall Islands government will allow people to live off the land. A 2024 lawsuit by the community over what's left of their compensation trust is still working its way through the US courts in 2026. If you're enjoying this kind of story, do follow me for more. I've got some properly strange islands lined up that you won't want to miss. What I want you to hold in your head while we go back to 1946 is who was actually on the beach. The Bikinians had been on Bikini Atoll for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years. The Marshall Islands are part of Micronesia, and the people who settled them came north from the Central Pacific around the start of the Common Era, in outrigger canoes navigated by stars and wave patterns. By 1946, the Bikinian community numbered 167 people. They were one of more than 30 island communities across the Marshalls, each with their own Iroij, the title the Navy translated as King when they filmed Judah agreeing to leave. Bikini Atoll itself is 23 small islands ringing a lagoon, roughly 230 square miles of water, surrounded by maybe 3 square miles of land. The Bikinians lived on Bikini Island, the largest of the 23, and farmed pandanus, breadfruit, coconut, and a few introduced plants. They fished the lagoon, which they knew intimately, and didn't venture much outside the reef. Like most Micronesian communities, their economy was based on what the lagoon and the soil could provide, which was enough. Then in 1944, the US Navy invaded the Marshall Islands as part of the Pacific War against Japan. The small Japanese garrison on Bikini was overrun in February of that year. The Bikinians weren't combatants. They were one of the few Marshallese communities to have been left almost untouched by the Japanese occupation, which had been brutal across much of the rest of the archipelago. After the war ended, the US administered the Marshall Islands under a UN trusteeship, with a stated obligation to safeguard the welfare of the Marshallese population. This is the legal frame the next bit of the story has to fit inside.
Of atomic energy that may become necessary, whether offensive or defensive.
In late 1945, the US military decided it needed an isolated Pacific atoll for a new kind of test. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been used against cities. Nobody, including the US Navy, knew what nuclear weapons would actually do to a fleet of warships. The Navy wanted to find out before the Soviets did.
This was this huge show, and it was just to show the Russians, hey, look what we have.
Bikini was selected because it was remote, the lagoon was large enough to anchor an entire mock fleet, the population was small enough to relocate, and the atoll sat inside the US trusteeship. On Sunday the 10th of February, 1946, after church, Commodore Ben H. Wyatt, the US Navy's military governor of the Marshall Islands, flew into Bikini and addressed the community. The Navy filmed it. Wyatt told the Bikinians that the US was developing weapons for the good of mankind and to end all world wars, and that it needed Bikini Atoll to do so. He compared them to the children of Israel, who had been led to a promised land. He asked if they would agree to leave for a little while. King Judah's recorded reply on the film is the line that fixed the deal in the legal record. He told the Navy, on camera, that his people would be pleased to go elsewhere. That was on the 10th of February 1946. The relocation began the following month. The Bikinians arrived at Rongerik Atoll on the 7th of March 1946. Rongerik is about 125 miles east of Bikini. The Navy had picked it because it was uninhabited and inside the trusteeship. They had not picked it because it was capable of supporting 167 people. It was not. Rongerik's lagoon is smaller than Bikini's. The fish in the lagoon carried ciguatera, a marine toxin that causes severe gastrointestinal illness and is functionally untreatable in a community with no doctor. The coconut palms and pandanus trees were stunted from poor soil and limited fresh water. The Navy had left the Bikinians with enough food rations to last a few weeks. After those ran out, the community began to starve. This was not invisible. The Bikinians sent messages back to US administrators through visiting Navy ships. The Navy's response, on the record, was that the situation was being monitored. The monitoring continued for 2 years. In late 1947, a US anthropologist called Leonard Mason was sent to assess conditions on Rongerik. Mason had been doing fieldwork across the Marshalls and was independent of the Navy chain of command. His report, when he filed it in February of 1948, said the Bikinians were severely malnourished, that several had died, and that the community was in immediate danger of collapse. The report was unambiguous enough that the US could not continue to claim the situation was under control. In March of 1948, the Bikinians were evacuated to Kwajalein, the US military base in the Central Marshalls, and put in temporary housing. They lived there for 8 months while the US searched for a replacement island. The replacement was Kili, a single small island in the southern Marshalls, about 1/3 of a square mile in area, with no lagoon. The Bikinians had been lagoon people for 2,000 years. They had no tradition of fishing in open ocean surf. The choice of Keely was not made by them. They were moved there in November of 1948 and told again that the relocation was temporary. Meanwhile, the Navy was conducting Operation Crossroads. Tests Able and Baker fired on Bikini in July of 1946 were the first peacetime nuclear detonations in history. Baker, an underwater shot, produced the iconic mushroom of water photograph that ended up on every Cold War atomic anxiety poster of the next 2 decades. The lagoon was contaminated, the test fleet sunk to the floor, and the Bikinians' homeland was now an active US weapons range. 21 further tests followed on Bikini between 1946 and 1958. They were grouped into operations called Crossroads, Castle, Red Wing, and Hardtack. The largest of all of them, by a long way, was the first detonation of Operation Castle. It was called Bravo, and it went off on the morning of the 1st of March 1954. Castle Bravo was designed to yield somewhere between 4 and 6 megatons of explosive force. It was the first deliverable thermonuclear weapon the US had ever tested, and the Atomic Energy Commission's calculations on what it would actually do were, it turned out, wrong. Specifically, they had assumed that lithium-7, one of the isotopes in the bomb's fuel, would not contribute to the reaction. It did. The runaway yield, when it came, was 15 megatons, roughly 1,000 times Hiroshima. The fallout did not behave as predicted either. The prevailing winds carried it east instead of north, across 2 inhabited atolls, Rongelap and Uterik. The Marshallese on Rongelap were not evacuated for 48 hours after the detonation. Their children played in what they thought was snow. By the time the US Navy arrived to remove them, they were suffering acute radiation symptoms. About 100 miles east of Bikini, a Japanese tuna boat called the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon 5, was also in the fallout path. All 23 crew members were sickened. One of them, the chief radio operator, Aikichi Kubayama, died 6 months later. The incident broke into the international press in a way the Marshallese contamination did not, and forced the US to admit, for the first time on the record, what the test had done. In 1968, 14 years after Castle Bravo, the Atomic Energy Commission announced that Bikini Atoll had been sufficiently studied and was safe for the Bikinians to go home. That announcement was the second promise about Bikini the US made on the record. Some of the Bikinians moved back. About 140 of them, mostly older Bikinians who had been alive on the beach in 1946, returned to Bikini Atoll over the early 1970s. The Atomic Energy Commission had said the island was safe. The Bikinians had spent 26 years on Kili and Edgit, where the soil was poor and the food was different, and they could see the open ocean instead of a lagoon, and they wanted to go home. What the Atomic Energy Commission's surveys hadn't measured was what cesium-137 actually does to a human body once it arrives through the food chain. That part they got wrong. Cesium-137 is one of the principal radionuclides produced by nuclear fission. It has a half-life of around 30 years. It binds to soil, gets taken up by coconut palms and breadfruit trees and pandanus, and then into anyone who eats them. The 1968 surveys had measured cesium in the soil. They had not adequately measured what would happen when people lived off that soil for years. In 1975, 3 years into the resettlement, US government scientists began doing whole-body radiation measurements on the returnees. The numbers came back high. By 1977, the cesium burdens were rising fast. Projected out a few years, cumulative doses would clear the federal safe exposure standard. In 1978, the US government re-evacuated the Bikinians from their own island for the second time in 30 years. I can't stop thinking about this part. The first time, in 1946, the islanders had been promised they could come back. They came back in the early 70s. They were told the place was safe to live on. They lived on it. Their bodies began absorbing cesium from the soil their crops were grown in. And then the US, having actually checked, took them off the island for a second time. The second evacuation was permanent in a way the first hadn't been. Bikini, in 1978, was officially classified as uninhabitable. The Bikinians sued. Their claims were eventually folded into a broader Marshall Islands compensation framework under the Compact of Free Association that took effect in 1986. The compact set up a nuclear claims tribunal with a $150 million trust fund to settle claims from the 4 affected atolls: Bikini, Eniwetok, Rongelap, Uterik. Between 1988 and 2009, the tribunal awarded more than $2 billion in damages, of which Bikini was awarded $563 million. About $2 million of that was actually paid. That's less than half of 1%. The trust fund had run out. The US Congress, asked repeatedly to top it up, didn't. In 2014, the Marshall Islands filed suit against all 9 nuclear-armed states in the International Court of Justice. The case was dismissed on jurisdiction in 2016. The unpaid tribunal balance, well over $2 billion, still sits there. And then in 2024 came something bleaker. The Bikinian community sued Arden Trust Company, the US bank entrusted with managing what compensation money actually existed. The complaint alleges that after Arden took over the trusts in 2018, it dispersed tens of millions in just a few years, gutting the resettlement fund and leaving the Bikini community in severe financial distress. That case is still working its way through the Delaware courts in 2026. Right now, in 2026, Kili Island has roughly 600 residents on a third of a square mile of land. The island floods regularly during king tides. The airstrip is functional, but increasingly unreliable. The community lives on a compact-funded subsidy that, by their own representatives' account, isn't enough to maintain a place that was never meant to be permanent. Bikini itself is administered jointly by the Bikini Atoll local government and the US Department of Energy. The cesium-137 levels in coconut and pandanus grown on the island, in the most recent published surveys, are still above the level the Marshall Islands government considers safe for permanent residents. The Department of Energy estimates that natural radioactive decay, with no further remediation, would bring Bikini's food chain to acceptable levels at some point after the year 2050. That's an estimate. It is not a plan to bring anyone home. King Judah died on Kili Island in the late 1960s, 20-odd years after the Bikinians arrived, and 20-odd years after the speech on the beach. He never went home. Then Wyatt, the Commodore in dress whites who gave the speech, never went back to Bikini either, though there's no record he wanted to. None of the 167 islanders who were on the beach in February of 1946 are alive in 2026. Their grandchildren are the ones petitioning the US courts. Their grandchildren are the ones flooding the Kili airstrip at high tide. Their grandchildren are the ones tying down what they can on the days when a king tide is forecast. Their grandchildren are the ones, in a community that didn't ask to inherit any of this, still trying to enforce the promise that was filmed 80 years ago. The film is still in the National Archives. You can find it online. It's been digitized. Commodore Wyatt is still in dress whites. King Judah is still on the beach. The recording is still there, exactly the way it was made. It just hasn't been kept. The story isn't the bombs. The story is the promise. Let me know in the comments where you'd like me to dig into next. There are some properly strange places left on this planet that most people have never heard of, and I'm not done with them yet.